April 9th, 1942, the Bataan Peninsula in the Philippines. A Japanese guard holds a bayonet inches from a starving American soldier's throat, demanding his gold Notre Dame class ring. The soldier reluctantly hands it over, certain he'll never see it again. Minutes later, a Japanese officer approaches and asks in perfect English, "Did my men take something from you?" The officer returns the ring and says something that stops the soldier cold. "I watched you score against USC in 1937. I was there. I graduated from USC the same year you graduated from Notre Dame. You clicked because a football rivalry somehow saved a man's life during the Bataan Death March. I'm about to show you exactly how that happened, and why this single moment of recognition changed everything. In the next 30 minutes, you'll discover the incredible true story of Mario Tonelli, the ring he refused to lose, the 70-yard run that made him a legend, and how one Japanese officer chose to see a fellow athlete instead of a disgraced prisoner. This story matters because it proves that even in hell, humanity can break through. Here's why you need to keep watching. Tonelli survived being burned over 80% of his body as a child. Doctors said he'd never walk. 9 years later, he was a college football star. He endured 42 months as a POW through starvation, disease, and torture that killed thousands around him. And here's the twist nobody expects. He wore that Notre Dame ring every single day for the rest of his life. When he died at age 86 in 2003, that ring was still on his finger. That ring became more than jewelry. It became proof that one moment of mercy can keep you alive through years of hell. If stories of resilience, unexpected humanity, and the power of hope speak to you, hit that like button. It helps others discover stories like this one. Let me take you back to where it all started, because understanding who Mario Tonelli was before the war makes what happened during it even more extraordinary. March 27, 1916. Mario George Tonelli was born in Lemont, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago, to Italian immigrant parents Celie and Lavenia Tonelli. He was a normal kid growing up in an Italian-American neighborhood until 1922, when everything changed. Mario was 6 years old when a trash incinerator fell on him, covering his small body in flames. He suffered third-degree burns over 80% of his body. Doctors told his parents he would never walk again. They said he'd be lucky to survive, but Mario's father refused to accept that diagnosis. He built a makeshift apparatus, a door mounted on wheels, so his son could move around while his body healed. Picture this, a 6-year-old boy, bandaged from head to toe, pushing himself around on a door with wheels. The pain must have been excruciating. Every movement stretched healing skin. Every bump sent jolts through burned nerve endings. But day after day, Mario kept pushing that door. His father watched, probably wondering if the doctors were right, if his son would ever have a normal life. For months, young Mario used this wheeled contraption. Then months turned to a year. Slowly, painfully, he rebuilt strength in muscles that had atrophied during healing. He started standing without the door, taking steps. The doctors had been catastrophically wrong. Not only did Mario walk again, he ran. And here's where the story gets almost unbelievable. By the time he reached high school at DePaul Academy in Chicago, he wasn't just walking. He was a 3-sport star athlete, competing in football, basketball, and track. Think about that progression. Doctors said he'd never walk. 9 years later, he's running routes on a football field, driving to the basket, competing in track meets. The kid who was supposed to be an invalid was outrunning everyone. That's not just physical recovery, that's the kind of mental toughness that years later would keep him alive when 98 pounds of skin and bones should have given up. In 1935, Mario enrolled at the University of Notre Dame. He made the varsity football team, wearing jersey number 58. And on November 27, 1937, he became part of Fighting Irish legend, Notre Dame versus USC. This wasn't just any game. This rivalry had become one of college football's most intense matchups, the season finale. Notre Dame Stadium packed with 40,000 fans, most of them freezing in late November weather. The score is tied 6-6 late in the fourth quarter. Notre Dame's season is on the line. One more score wins it, one mistake ends it. The ball is snapped deep in Irish territory, somewhere around their own 20-yard line, depending on which account you read. Different newspapers reported slightly different starting positions, but that's the fog of real-time reporting. What matters is this: Notre Dame was backed up near their own goal line with the season hanging in the balance. The quarterback takes the snap, hands off to number 58, Mario Tonelli. He hits the left side of the line. The USC defense converges. But Tonelli finds a seam, maybe luck, maybe vision, maybe both, and breaks free into open field. Now he's running, 70 yards, maybe 77. The exact distance varies depending on the source, but here's what doesn't vary. It was one of the longest runs of the season, and every single person in that stadium was on their feet screaming. He's got daylight. He's got blockers. USC defenders are chasing, but they can't catch him. He's tackled near the goal line, somewhere between the 8 and 13-yard line, depending on which newspaper you read. Doesn't matter. The damage is done. Notre Dame has momentum. On the very next play, Notre Dame punches it in for the touchdown. Final score, Notre Dame 13, USC 6. Game over. Season saved. After the game, reporters asked Tonelli about that famous run. His response? "I don't remember that run. I don't know just what I was thinking about, except just to run." Classic Mario, humble, understated, focused only on the team. In 1939, Mario Tonelli graduated from Notre Dame. He received his class ring, gold, with a black onyx inset, Notre Dame, inscribed on the sides, his initials and graduation date engraved underneath. That same year, the Chicago Cardinals drafted him in the 21st round of the NFL Draft. In 1940, he played one season for the Cardinals. His football career was just beginning, and then the world went to war. Drop a comment if you've ever heard a story about someone overcoming impossible odds. I want to know, what keeps people going when everything says they should quit? In March 1941, Mario Tonelli enlisted in the United States Army. He reported to Camp Wallace in Texas and was later assigned to the 200th Coast Artillery, an anti-aircraft unit stationed at Fort Bliss, Texas. The 200th was a New Mexico National Guard unit, one of the best anti-aircraft regiments in the Army, according to the War Department. These men were trained, disciplined, and ready. Many of them were bilingual, speaking both English and Spanish, which would later influence their deployment to the Philippines, where Spanish was still widely understood from centuries of colonial rule. The regiment was equipped with 3-inch anti-aircraft guns, 50-caliber machine guns mounted on half-tracks, and massive searchlights for nighttime defense. They drilled constantly. They could set up a gun emplacement in minutes. They could track aircraft by sound before they appeared on the horizon. The War Department called them the best anti-aircraft regiment in the United States Army. That wasn't empty praise. These men were elite. In September 1941, the 200th Coast Artillery deployed to the Philippines. They were stationed at Fort Stotzenburg, which would later become Clark Field, about 75 miles north of Manila. They set up anti-aircraft guns, 50 caliber machine guns, and searchlights. Their mission: defend the Philippines from potential Japanese aggression. At that point, war seemed possible, but not certain. The men didn't know they had just 3 months left before everything exploded. December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor. Every American knows that date, but here's what many don't know. The Philippines were attacked the very next day, December 8th, due to the international dateline. Clark Field, where Tonelli and the 200th Coast Artillery were stationed, was bombed by Japanese aircraft. The 200th Coast Artillery became the first American unit to fire on Japanese aircraft in the Philippines. They shot down several planes, but the damage was done. The invasion had begun. For the next 4 months, American and Filipino forces fought a desperate delaying action on the Bataan Peninsula. This was the Alamo of the Pacific, 90,000 American and Filipino troops holding out against a larger, better supplied Japanese force. They were buying time for the United States to regroup after Pearl Harbor, to mobilize, to prepare for the long war everyone knew was coming. Every day they held Bataan was another day for the U.S. to build planes, train soldiers, move ships into position. But no help came. The Roosevelt administration had decided on a Germany-first strategy. Europe was the priority. The Pacific would have to wait. Ships that could have reinforced the Philippines went to Britain instead. Planes went to North Africa. The men on Bataan knew they'd been abandoned, but they kept fighting anyway because that's what soldiers do. General Douglas MacArthur was evacuated from the Philippines in March 1942 with the famous promise, "I shall return." The men he left behind knew what that meant. They were on their own, no reinforcements, no supplies, no evacuation plans. They were going to fight until they couldn't fight anymore, and then they were going to die or surrender. Those were the only options. By early April 1942, conditions on Bataan were catastrophic. The troops were starving. They were down to half rations, then quarter rations. Malaria, dysentery, and dengue fever ravaged the ranks. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. The Japanese tightened their grip. On April 9, 1942, Major General Edward P. King made the decision to surrender against MacArthur's orders. It was the largest surrender in American military history up to that point. Approximately 75,000 to 78,000 troops, 12,000 Americans, and 66,000 Filipinos became prisoners of war. The Japanese had expected to capture maybe 10,000 to 25,000 prisoners. They were completely unprepared for 3 times that number. They had no food, no water, no transportation, and no plan. What happened next would go down in history as one of the worst war crimes of World War II. If you're finding value in this story and you want to see more historical deep dives like this, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. I've got more stories about resilience and survival coming your way. The Bataan Death March began on April 9, 1942. 75,000 starving, sick, exhausted prisoners were forced to march approximately 65 miles from Mariveles on the southern tip of Bataan to San Fernando, then transported by rail to Camp O'Donnell. The march took anywhere from 5 to 10 days, depending on where you started. And here's the critical context you need to understand. The Japanese military culture, rooted in the Bushido Code, viewed surrender as the ultimate dishonor. Japanese soldiers were taught that death was preferable to capture. So when they looked at American and Filipino POWs, they saw men who had dishonored themselves, men who deserved contempt, not mercy. The conditions of the march were beyond brutal. Let me paint this picture clearly so you understand what these men endured. No food provided by the Japanese, no water. Temperatures soared into the 90s and past 100 degrees Fahrenheit. These men had been on starvation rations for months already. They were sick with malaria, dysentery, dengue fever. Now they were being forced to walk 65 miles in tropical heat with no water. Men who fell were beaten with rifle butts. Men who asked for water were shot or bayoneted on the spot. Some prisoners were beheaded for sport, Japanese officers practicing their sword techniques on defenseless captives. Japanese soldiers used rifle butts to beat anyone who slowed down. If you stopped to help a fallen comrade, you risked being executed right next to him. Men died of dehydration, men died of heat stroke, men died from summary execution because a guard was having a bad day. Those who survived the march described watching Japanese tanks deliberately run over prisoners who had collapsed in the road, grinding them into the dirt while other prisoners were forced to keep marching past their crushed comrades. The psychological horror was as bad as the physical horror. You're watching your friends die. You can't help them. If you try, you die too. So you keep walking. You step over bodies. You ignore the screams. You shut down everything human inside you and become a walking corpse focused only on the next step and the step after that, because if you stop moving, you die. The casualty numbers tell the story, though estimates vary because of the chaos. Approximately 500 to 700 Americans died during the march itself. Between 5,000 and 10,000 Filipinos died. But that's just the march. When survivors reached Camp O'Donnell, conditions were even worse. In just 71 days of operation, over 1,500 Americans and 26,000 Filipinos died in that camp from disease, starvation, and brutality. Mario Tonelli was in that march, starving, sick, watching men around him die. And somewhere during the first day or two, the ring incident happened. Here's how Tonelli described it years later, and this account has been verified across multiple independent sources, including Notre Dame University archives, the U.S. Army Historical Foundation, and interviews with Tonelli himself. A Japanese guard approached Tonelli, bayonet fixed to his rifle, blade gleaming in the tropical sun. The guard pointed at Tonelli's hand. He wanted the gold Notre Dame class ring. Tonelli understood immediately. This wasn't a request. It was a demand backed by a very sharp piece of steel. Another prisoner nearby, a man whose name Tonelli never recorded, whispered in desperate urgency, "Give it to him or he'll kill you." That prisoner had seen this play out before. Refusal meant death. Hesitation meant death. The only option was compliance. Tonelli loved that ring. It represented everything he'd overcome. The childhood burns that should have killed him, learning to walk again when doctors said it was impossible, Notre Dame, his football triumph, his graduation, his brief NFL career. It was the physical embodiment of his entire life before this nightmare. But he wasn't stupid. He wasn't going to die for a piece of jewelry, no matter how much it meant to him. He slipped the ring off his finger and handed it to the guard. He watched the guard walk away with his ring, and something inside him broke. He'd already lost his freedom, his health, his country's protection. He'd been abandoned by his government. Now he'd lost the one tangible connection to who he used to be. The ring disappeared into the guard's pocket, and with it went the last piece of Mario Tonelli, the football player. Now he was just another starving POW waiting to die. Minutes passed, maybe 10, maybe 20. Time had lost meaning in the heat and the horror. Then something unexpected happened that would change the trajectory of Tonelli's entire war. A Japanese officer approached. Not a guard, an officer. You could tell by the uniform, the bearing, the sword at his side. He stopped in front of Tonelli and spoke in perfect, unaccented English. Not broken English, not heavily accented English. Perfect English, the kind you'd hear from an American college graduate. "Did my men take something from you?" Tonelli was stunned. For the past few months, Japanese soldiers had communicated through screaming, beating, and shooting. Now one is asking him a polite question in perfect English? He didn't know what to say. Was this a trap? Was the officer testing him? Would admitting the theft get him killed for complaining? But something in the officer's voice suggested genuine concern. Tonelli took the risk. He admitted that yes, his ring had been taken. The officer's expression changed. He looked angry, but not at Tonelli, at his own men. Without another word, the officer turned and walked back toward where the guards were gathered. Tonelli watched, confused. What was happening? A few minutes later, the officer returned. In his hand was the Notre Dame class ring. Gold band, black onyx. Notre Dame, inscribed on the sides. The officer handed it to Tonelli. Then the officer said something that stops you in your tracks, even hearing it decades later. He looked at Tonelli, really looked at him, not through him like the guards did, but at him as a human being, and said, "I watched you score against USC in 1937. I was there. I graduated from USC the same year you graduated from Notre Dame." Let that sink in for a moment. Two men, standing on a road in the Philippines during one of the worst atrocities of World War II. One is an officer in the Imperial Japanese Army. The other is a starving American POW. And between them, a college football game, a rivalry game on a November afternoon in South Bend, Indiana. A 70-yard run that broke USC's heart and made Tonelli a Notre Dame legend. The officer had been there. He'd watched from the USC side, watched his team lose, watched number 58 break through the line and dash their championship hopes. And 5 years later, on the other side of the world, in the middle of a war where both sides had dehumanized each other to the point of atrocity, this Japanese officer recognized the American prisoner as that football player. And instead of seeing an enemy deserving of contempt, he saw a fellow college graduate, a fellow athlete, someone who had once done something remarkable on a football field when they were both young and the world made sense. The officer told Tonelli to hide the ring better. Then he gave Tonelli a look that seemed to say, "I can't protect you from what's coming, but I can give you this." And then he walked away. His name was never recorded in any official document. Tonelli never learned it. He believed the officer likely died in the war. But in that moment on the Bataan Death March, with death all around, that Japanese officer made a choice that most of his countrymen did not. He chose to see the American soldier not as a dishonorable prisoner, but as a fellow human being, a former athlete, someone who had once done something remarkable on a football field. Tonelli later said that moment changed everything for him. That ring became more than jewelry. It became his talisman, his reason to believe he could survive. Every time he looked at it, he remembered that even in hell, humanity could break through. The march continued. Men died by the hundreds. Tonelli kept walking. When they finally reached Camp O'Donnell, he was sick, starving, and broken, but alive, and he still had his ring. Take a moment and hit that notification bell so you don't miss what happens next, because Tonelli's story was just beginning. Camp O'Donnell was a death trap. The facility was originally designed to hold maybe 10,000 prisoners. It was crammed with over 50,000 men. Do the math on that. 5 times capacity. There was almost no food. The water supply was contaminated with bacteria and parasites. There was no medical care beyond what fellow prisoners could improvise. Disease was rampant. Dysentery swept through the camp. Malaria was endemic. Men died at a rate of dozens per day. sometimes hundreds. Tonelli contracted malaria within weeks, then scurvy from vitamin C deficiency. His gums bled, his teeth loosened, his skin bruised at the slightest touch. Then beriberi from B vitamin deficiency, which caused nerve damage and swelling. Then dysentery, which meant constant diarrhea and dehydration that made the other diseases worse. His body was eating itself from the inside. Every system was failing. He was wasting away, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. In just 71 days of operation, Camp O'Donnell killed over 1,500 Americans, 26,000 Filipinos. That's not over the course of the war. That's in 71 days, 2.5 months. Think about that death rate. If you were imprisoned there, your odds of surviving even that short period were worse than 50-50. After 2 months at Camp O'Donnell, Tonelli was transferred to Cabanatuan Prison Camp No. 1. Conditions were marginally better, which isn't saying much. The prisoners were forced into slave labor, working in rice paddies and construction projects under brutal guards who beat them for working too slowly, for resting, for being sick, for making eye contact for no reason at all. Tonelli kept his ring hidden in a small metal soap dish. Every night, when the guards weren't watching, he'd take it out. He'd hold it. Look at it. Remember Notre Dame. Remember wearing number 58. Remember the feel of the football in his hands, the roar of the crowd, the moment when he broke through the line and saw nothing but open field ahead of him. Remember being strong. Remember being free. Remember being Mario Tonelli, the football player, not prisoner number whatever the hell he was now. Other prisoners saw what he was doing. Some of them found their own talismans. A photograph they'd somehow kept hidden. A letter from home, worn and illegible from being handled so many times. A religious medal. A coin. Small reminders that they were still human, still connected to a world beyond the wire and the guards and the starvation. These little rituals kept them sane, kept them human, kept them alive when their bodies said they should be dead. In October 1942, Tonelli was transferred to Davao Penal Colony, called Dapicol, on the island of Mindanao. This was a huge agricultural camp where prisoners worked in rice paddies under the tropical sun. Tonelli contracted an intestinal parasite that caused severe abdominal pain. Of the 2,009 POWs held at Dapicol, only 805 survived the war. Think about that ratio. More than half died. Tonelli watched men around him give up. Some died of disease. Some simply lost the will to keep fighting and faded away. But Tonelli had his ring, and somehow that was enough. In the summer of 1944, the Japanese began moving POWs from the Philippines to Japan. The Americans were advancing. The Philippines would eventually be liberated. The Japanese wanted to move their prisoner labor force to Japan, where they could work in factories and mines, supporting the war effort. They loaded prisoners onto cargo ships that would become known in history as hell ships. Tonelli was packed into the hold of a ship called the Maru with hundreds of other prisoners. Imagine the cargo hold of a ship, dark. No ventilation, no portholes. Now imagine that space packed with human beings, packed so tightly that you can't sit down. You're standing pressed against the bodies of men on all sides. It's hot. Tropical heat plus body heat plus no ventilation means temperatures well over 100 degrees. There's no sanitation. Men defecate where they stand. Men vomit where they stand. The smell is beyond description. The air is thick and heavy, hard to breathe. And this isn't for an hour or a day. The journey took 62 days. 62 days in that hell. No light, no space, no dignity, Bodies pressed together so tightly you couldn't fall down even if you fainted. Men died standing up, and their bodies couldn't fall because there was no room. You stood there, pressed against corpses, for hours until guards finally dragged the bodies out. The psychological trauma of that experience is incomprehensible. You're in the dark, in hell, watching men die inches from your face, and you can't move, can't breathe, can't escape. All you can do is endure and hope you don't die before the ship reaches port. Tonelli's weight dropped to barely 100 pounds during that voyage. He was 6 feet tall, and he weighed 100 pounds. His body was consuming itself, muscle, organ tissue, everything, just to stay alive one more day. An estimated 21,000 Allied POWs died on hell ships during the war. Some from disease, some from starvation, some from dehydration. And tragically, some were killed by friendly fire. American submarines and aircraft attacked Japanese cargo vessels, not knowing Allied prisoners were inside. The ships weren't marked. They looked like any other enemy cargo ship. U.S. forces torpedoed them, bombed them, sank them. Thousands of Allied POWs drowned in the holds of those ships, trapped below decks as water rushed in. Imagine surviving years of captivity only to be killed by your own side because nobody knew you were there. Tonelli survived his hell ship. That fact alone is remarkable. When he arrived in Japan, he was transferred to a work camp near Yokkaichi, a city on the east coast of Honshu. He was forced to do hard labor despite weighing less than a child. 10 months of breaking rocks, hauling materials, building things for the Japanese war effort, while his body screamed for rest, for food, for medicine that would never come. In June 1945, Tonelli was transferred again, this time to a scrap metal plant. And here's where something almost supernatural happened. The Japanese assigned him a prison number, 58. The exact same number he wore playing football for Notre Dame. The same number he wore for the Chicago Cardinals. He took it as an omen. He told fellow prisoners, "This is a sign. I'm going to survive this. 58 is my number. I'm going to make it home." 2 months later, in August 1945, atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered. On August 27, 1945, American forces liberated Tonelli's camp. He had been a prisoner of war for 1,236 days, 42 months, 3.5 years. When he was liberated, he weighed 98 pounds. He'd gone into the war at around 190 to 212 pounds, depending on the source. He'd lost more than half his body weight. The medical effects of his imprisonment would plague him for the rest of his life. Malaria recurred periodically. The intestinal parasites caused permanent damage. Malnutrition had weakened his bones and organs, but he was alive. And on his finger, hidden through all those camps and marches and hellship journeys, his Notre Dame class ring. I've linked some resources about POW survival psychology and the Bataan Death March in the description if you want to learn more about this period in history. Check those out after the video. Here's what happened next, and this part gives me chills every time I read about it. October 28, 1945. Less than 2 months after liberation, less than 2 months after weighing 98 pounds, the Chicago Cardinals were playing the Green Bay Packers, and on the Cardinals roster for that game, number 58, Mario Tonelli. He weighed maybe 140 pounds, maybe 180. Sources vary, but even at the high end, he was still dramatically underweight for his frame. He was still recovering, still processing the trauma, still dealing with recurring malaria, still fighting the effects of malnutrition. His body was broken, his mind was shattered, and he played professional football. Why? Cardinals owner Charlie Bidwell could have just released Tonelli, could have said, "Thanks for your service. Good luck." Nobody would have blamed him. But Bidwill honored Tonelli's pre-war contract and put him on the roster for one game specifically to make him eligible for an NFL pension. One game meant Tonelli would have financial security, health care benefits, recognition as an NFL veteran. Bidwill didn't have to do that. He chose to. In a world where Mario Tonelli had seen the worst of humanity, here was one man showing him the best. Tonelli played that one game and retired from football. His athletic career was over. His body had been through too much, but his life, his real life, the life that would define him for the next 58 years, was just beginning again. In 1946, at age 30, Mario Tonelli became the youngest Cook County Commissioner in Illinois history. He dedicated the next 42 years of his life to public service. 42 years, the same number of months he spent as a POW. He worked in environmental protection in county government, helping his community rebuild just as he had rebuilt himself. He rarely spoke about the war. His friend Ray Meyer, the legendary DePaul basketball coach, said, "He never ever spoke about the war." When reporters asked, Tonelli deflected. The trauma was too deep, too personal. He'd survived by focusing forward, and that's what he kept doing. But late in his life, Tonelli began speaking at schools. He told his story to young people. He talked about resilience, about hope, about the ring that symbolized everything. And always, always, he wore that Notre Dame class ring. On January 7th, 2003, Mario Tonelli died at age 86 at Northwestern Memorial Hospital in Chicago. When he died, that Notre Dame ring was still on his finger, 64 years after he received it at graduation, 61 years after a Japanese officer returned it to him on the Bataan Death March. He never took it off. It was part of him. It was the symbol of everything he'd survived and everything he'd become. Let me recap what you just heard, because this story has layers that deserve a moment to sink in. You learned about a man who survived third-degree burns over 80% of his body as a child. Doctors said he'd never walk. He became a college football star. You heard about one of the most famous plays in Notre Dame football history, a 70-plus yard run against USC that won the game. You learned about the Bataan Death March, where 75,000 prisoners were forced to march 65 miles with no food, no water, under brutal conditions. You heard about the ring incident, the moment when a USC-educated Japanese officer recognized Mario Tonelli from that 1937 game and returned his stolen Notre Dame ring. You learned about 42 months as a POW through multiple camps, hell ships, starvation, disease, and unimaginable suffering. And you heard about a man who came home weighing 98 pounds, played one more NFL game, and then dedicated 42 years to serving his community. You now understand that survival isn't just physical, it's psychological. It's about finding something, anything, to hold on to when everything else is stripped away. For Mario Tonelli, it was a gold ring with a black onyx stone and the words Notre Dame engraved on the sides. That ring represented his past, his identity, his refusal to let go of who he was before the war tried to destroy him. And it represented something else. The idea that even in the darkest moments, when humans are capable of the worst atrocities, there are still flashes of decency, moments when someone makes the choice to be kind. Here's what I want you to take from this. When you face something that seems impossible, when the world tells you that you can't survive, when everything around you says to give up, find your ring. Find the thing that reminds you who you are. For Tonelli, it was literally a piece of jewelry. For you, it might be a memory, a person, a goal, a purpose. Find it, hold on to it, and refuse to let go. If this story moved you, Do two things. First, subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you don't miss the next story. Second, share this video with someone who needs to hear about resilience and survival, someone going through their own battle. Mario Tonelli's story deserves to be told, and you can help make sure it reaches the people who need it most. In my next video, I'm revealing another incredible World War II story that almost nobody knows about. The time a German fighter pilot escorted a crippled American bomber to safety instead of shooting it down. It's called the Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler incident, and it's one of the most beautiful examples of humanity in warfare you'll ever hear. That video drops in a few days. Subscribe so you catch it. Mario Tonelli taught us that the human spirit is unbreakable if you give it something to fight for. He lived that lesson every day of his life. And that Notre Dame ring? It's now part of history, a symbol of survival, of hope, and of the idea that even enemies can recognize each other's humanity. I'll see you in the next one.